US Secretary of State John Kerry will meet his Russian counterpart Sergei Lavrov later today in Geneva, where they'll discuss the Russian plan to put Syria's chemical weapons beyond use. It was at last week's G20 summit in St. Petersburg that Presidents Putin and Obama first discussed the idea of putting Syrian chemical weapons under international control. Then, at a press conference on Monday, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov urged the Syrians to not only agree on placing chemical weapon storage sites under international control, but also on their subsequent destruction. The plan was welcomed by the Syrians, who, for the first time, seemed to acknowledge that they are in possession of a chemical weapons stockpile. In a broadcast to the American people on Tuesday night, President Obama confirmed that plans for strikes against Syria were on hold, and votes in Congress, where the president looked like he might be heading for defeat, were also postponed. But scepticism remains about the intentions of the Russians and their Syrian allies, as well as the practicalities of sending weapons inspectors into a war zone. Well, joining me from outside the Kremlin is Daniel Samford, the BBC's Moscow correspondent. Thank you, Daniel. Will this plan work? Is Russian diplomacy going to be successful?
Well, it slightly depends what you think it is that the Russians are trying to achieve. You have to remember that the whole basis of Russian diplomacy is what is in the Russian interest. And in this case, the main thing that is in the Russian interest is to prevent military strikes by the Americans on their ally in the Middle East, Syria. So that is what this plan is all about. The question is whether, in order to prevent those military strikes on Syria, they have to move very, very fast to get these chemical weapons under control and start the process of the destruction of those chemical weapons, or whether the Russians and the Syrians think that actually by a protracted negotiation, by drawing the whole thing out, they'll achieve their aim of preventing the military strikes anyway without having to do very much about the chemical weapons.
Now, interestingly, Vladimir Putin has written in the New York Times in quite an unusual move. What's he had to say in terms of appealing to the electorate in the US?
Well, it's an intriguing article. Vladimir Putin, I think, feels there's a moment of weakness in the American leadership, and he's chosen to address the American public directly on some of the areas where he feels he can touch a chord. For example, he said that any potential strike by the United States would produce more innocent victims and escalation, spreading the conflicts far beyond Syria's borders, and crucially, unleash a new wave of terrorism, as he puts it. And he said that millions around the world increasingly see America not as a model of democracy, but as relying solely on brute force. So he's really trying to press some buttons there in the American public to try and keep up the pressure on the administration in the States not to go ahead with any military strike.
I mean, there has been a debate here and obviously in the US that the Russians have to some extent outmaneuvered President Obama. Is that very much the feeling in Moscow?
Yeah, I think that is the view. I mean, I think there are some nuances to that. I mean, I think the Russians want to get more central on the world stage, and I think they've seen this as being an opportunity to try and be at the heart of something. And I do believe that when on Monday John Kerry said, well, you know, the only way of stopping the strike would be if the Syrians were to put their chemical weapons under international control, and they won't do that. I do think the Russians saw that as an opportunity which they needed to act on very, 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 very fast. And now they have the initiative. They are holding the key to this prevention of these military strikes and trying to sort out the chemical weapons problem in Syria, and they're not going to let anyone try and get the initiative back off them. And I think that's obviously potentially a very good thing in terms of securing the chemical weapons, but it may be quite an awkward thing for American, British and French diplomacy.
Daniel Samford in Moscow, thank you very much. Well, joining me now is the Respect MP George Galloway. George Galloway, picking up on the first point, how genuine do you think the Russians are in terms of ensuring that the Syrians place, or not only place their chemical weapons under international control, but destroy them as well?
Absolutely. And as President Obama said, they're putting their prestige on the line, and Russia is very clearly back right at the centre of world events. It's the beginning of history, not the end of it as Fukuyama projected 20 years ago. The Russians are back. Dame Pauline will be shivering in her shoes at the idea of the Russians with snow on their boots being back. But they're back, and we have to live with that. So definitely this matter always could have been resolved by negotiation, will be resolved by negotiation, and the whole crisis has to be resolved by negotiation.
But do you think that the Syrians will, in the timetable that is being placed, actually put those... And is it practical for them to actually do it, bearing in mind there is a war, as we all know, going on, for inspectors to go in there to verify them, to destroy them, and, of course, which is what the Syrians and the Russians both want, stop any threat of airstrikes?
Well, I do, and I hope the inspectors then relocate to Israel, which has a mountain of chemical, biological and even nuclear weapons. But nobody's talking about that, at least not yet.
Well, no, let's concentrate just on Syria. Are you shivering in your boots,
No.
shaking in your boots over the Russians being back?
I do think it's the case that at the moment the Russians are on the saddle, but they've now got to demonstrate that actually they're going in a meaningful direction. What has to happen now is a really genuinely serious negotiation. And Sanford's distinction between are they going to do something purposeful or are they going to muck about, that's an absolutely crucial question.
What do you think?
Well, I don't know. I think they're on test. I would hope that this turns out, even if it didn't intend it seriously, that it turns out to be something that's actually serious. Because I think it getting the chemical weapons out of the battlefield is a good thing in its own right.
Right. Because the
very difficult. Let us not underestimate the difficulty of doing it.
Right.
I mean, I think that is going to be one of the big issues.
Is
and
the
I don't think it's going
practicality.
to be done in one day. Absolutely not. This is going to take time.
The Foreign Secretary, William Hague, has actually just said that he's sceptical, surprise, surprise, of the plan, of the offer being made by the Russians. And he says so because President Assad's regime has lied for years about possessing chemical weapons and still denies using them, but has denied actually possessing them right up until very recently. That is a valid point.
Well, as the harlot Mandy Rice Davis said, he would say that, wouldn't he? Because he and David Cameron have been left with egg all over their face. If it had been left to them, we'd already be in the midst of a Middle East war with all the disastrous consequences that President Putin wrote about in the New York Times today or the Washington Post today. So I wouldn't place too much reliance on the Foreign Secretary for not much longer.
But President Assad has lied about possessing chemical weapons, and now they've admitted...
They all lie about them. Israel lies about them. The United States sought a derogation from the Chemical Weapons Treaty so it could continue to hold its stockpiles of chemical weapons. They all lie and obfuscate about this question.
Well,
we need to ban all chemical weapons.
I don't begin to accept all of that, but and this is a very unsavoury regime, and they can't be relied upon. So the real issue is, are the Russians serious?
Why did you billet him with the Queen?
Serious?
You were one of the people that advised the Queen to have him in her spare bedroom. Why did you do that?
Right, well, hang on. Let's have a look. Let's have a look at the issue, though, of the chemical weapons, because this is the key. The consensus in many Western nations is that Assad is responsible for that chemical weapons attack. What say you?
I don't believe that, and I think
Why not?
Because as soon as President Obama drew his red line, it was an open invitation for just such a provocation.
Well, I think he regrets it now, actually.
To bring about the... Well, he's now denying that he even drew it. But that's a measure of the fiasco that this has become.
I don't think, George, we would be in this diplomatic situation if the Americans hadn't actually made it quite clear they were serious about this.
You would say that.
I know, exactly. Yeah, we're not going to agree.
It's the threat that has brought the Russians and the Syrians to this point.
Joe, I said in Parliament last week, it's not that they're not bad enough to have done this chemical weapons attack. They are. But they're not mad enough to have done it. To bring about the very deluge of international force against them that they've managed to avoid so far.
What do you say to that?
I think the evidence is pretty clear that they have actually done this, and the issue is that it mustn't go any further. It is very important. I mean, I do think this is an initiative in its own right that is worthwhile. The great question is what follows. Does it lead us then onto a diplomatic track, or do we then go back, actually, to a continuation of fighting and the military option?
And there's no support for that. This is the key point. He's got Obama off the hook because the Congress was about to throw out the idea of an American
I think the Congress will be pretty tough if the Russians show that they're just trying to twist the US round their little finger. I think the American reaction will be pretty tough, and the congressional reaction will be pretty tough.
And they are ready to go, so say the Americans. It is not, it seems, an empty threat, even if you are right in saying that actually President Obama personally does not want to get engaged in a war in Syria. If the Russians, as Pauline Neville-Jones has said, and the Syrians don't actually put their money where their mouth is, then those airstrikes would happen.
Well, you should take your tanks off the lawn because nobody wants to use these tanks, neither the British public nor the American public. Now, I know that democracy doesn't mean much to some people. The idea is that leaders make these decisions, but public opinion is completely against it. And the BBC, which is funded by public opinion, or the public who have that opinion, really ought to wise up, because your role as the wartime propaganda mouthpiece
George Galloway,
is really infuriating people,
just you
the
being
length
deliberately
and breadth
provocative.
of this country.
Let's get back to the substance.
You're going
of
to
the
lose
issue.
your licence fee over this.
Well, you don't have to threaten me. Let's get back to the issue at hand. You say you don't think Assad was mad enough to use chemical weapons, so you're going against all the intelligence, or certainly the vast majority
of it. Why do you say that? Where is the intelligence? Show it to me.
Services,
You've got lots of papers here.
do,
Show
but I
me
don't
the
actually
intelligence.
have
No, you don't. No one has it.
Where's your evidence to say it wasn't?
I'm saying that
Where's your evidence to say that it wasn't Assad's regime?
My argument is logic, that it brought about the very prospect of international engagement in the war, which they had avoided so far.
Well, OK, let's hear.
It's not as if this is the very first time that chemical weapons have been used. Bad men use chemical weapons.
Yes.
Had Saddam Hussein used chemical weapons?
George Bush used them.
Against his own...
Tony Blair used them, and you supported them.
Let Pauline speak, and then I'll come back to you.
And I mean, I think logic doesn't actually hold up against what the evidence shows. And I think the Russians do understand actually that this is a dangerous moment, and that actually this man can use it again. They see it as their advantage actually to get this off the battlefield. Undoubtedly, they don't want to see the American strike, because even if we don't take, or a lot of people don't take, the effect of an American strike seriously, I'm sure the Russians do.
OK, well, let's hear, George Galloway, who you think was responsible for supplying al-Qaeda forces in Syria, as you put it, with chemical weapons.
If there has been a use of chemical weapons, it was al-Qaeda who used the chemical weapons. Who gave al-Qaeda the chemical weapons? Here's my theory. Israel gave them the chemical weapons.
Where's your evidence?
It's a theory, and it's superseded by my new theory, which is that Saudi Arabia gave it to them. And everyone who knows anything about the Middle East knows the depth of the involvement of Prince Bandar bin Sultan bin Abdulaziz, one of Pauline's great heroes. He is the man who has fueled and armed this war. And I now believe that Saudi Arabia gave al-Qaeda these chemical weapons.
But you admit it's theory.
Theory, of course.
Theory,
of course.
there is
I don't
no
have
evidence.
I'm not her.
Basis.
I'm not the head of the intelligence agency.
But you are throwing out conspiracy theories, which is what some people would say, and they're not based on any evidence either.
They're based on logic. Everyone knows.
Your logic.
Bandar. No, this is why. See, you don't know this because you're not a specialist in the area, and I don't blame you for that.
And you are.
I am, yes. That's why you brought me here.
Is that right?
Yes. That's why you brought me here, isn't it?
Go on.
Why did you bring me here then? Because I'm the MP for Bradford.
Yes, that's why we brought
you brought me here because I am a specialist in the area.
But it is.
And I'm telling you, Saudi Arabia is up to its neck. The grisly, hand-chopping, head-cutting regime of Saudi Arabia, so beloved of people like Dame Pauline.
Do you think Israel would like that sort of regime on its border?
Israel wants them all to kill each other for as long as possible.
There's an implicit admission already in Damascus that actually they do have chemical weapons in their possession. And where they're going to be found will demonstrate actually who is the custodian of these chemical weapons. And I don't have any doubt it's going to turn out that actually these are in the possession of and under the control of the regime in Syria.
The Syrian regime has chemical weapons, as does the Israeli regime, as does the American regime, as does the British regime. The British were the first people to use chemical weapons in the Middle East. Mr. Churchill used them on Kurdish tribesmen in the north of Iraq in 1921.
Do you think there will be any military intervention in Syria?
I think at the moment we can't tell. I think we can't tell. I do think that it will return as a serious option if this diplomatic initiative does not succeed.
George Galloway.
As always, a pleasure.
A specialist on the Middle East, in his own words. Thank you so much.